Bullies tear new girl's dress. Big mistake. She's an unstoppable fighter. Marley Davidson stood at the entrance of Jefferson High School, clutching her worn backpack straps as students streamed past her like she was invisible. The September morning air carried a chill that cut through her thin cardigan, a hand-me-down from the local thrift store that her grandmother had carefully mended just last week. At 16, she was small for her age, barely 5 feet tall with mousy brown hair that hung limply around her pale face, the ends uneven from her grandmother's attempt at trimming it to save money at the salon. Her clothes were simple and unremarkable, thrift store finds that bore the telltale signs of previous owners, faded colors and slightly outdated styles that marked her as different before she even opened her mouth. The thick-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose had been the cheapest option at the discount vision center, their heavy frames leaving red marks on the bridge of her nose by the end of each day. She'd transferred here from 3 states away after her grandmother's job relocation, leaving behind not just the only life she'd ever known, but also the few friends who had accepted her quirks and understood her silences. The move had been sudden, necessitated by her grandmother's company downsizing and offering positions only at their Midwest branch. They'd packed their meager belongings into a rental truck over a single weekend, driving through the night to save money on a motel. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with the typical Monday morning chaos that seemed amplified to Marley's anxious senses. Lockers slammed shut with metallic bangs that made her flinch. Expensive sneakers squeaked against polished floors that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. And conversations about weekend parties, football games, and social media drama filled the air with a cacophony that made her head spin. She could smell various colognes and perfumes, mixing with the underlying scent of industrial cleaning products and teenage sweat. Marley navigated through the crowd with practiced invisibility, keeping her head down and her steps quick, but not so quick as to draw attention. She'd learned long ago that drawing attention rarely ended well for someone like her, someone who didn't have the right clothes, the right look, or the right connections to navigate the brutal social hierarchy of high school. Her morning had started at 4:45 a.m., as it had every morning for the past 8 years. While other teenagers were deep in sleep, Marley had been in her Uncle Marcus's converted garage, her bare feet silent on the training mats as she moved through her forms. The space smelled of sweat and determination, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected her movements back at her, showing every imperfection that needed correction. Marcus had been particularly intense that morning, perhaps sensing her anxiety about another week at the new school. They'd worked on close-quarter combat techniques, the kind designed for when an attacker had you pinned against a wall or grabbed you from behind. "Remember," he'd said, his scarred hands adjusting her stance, "your size is an advantage if you know how to use it. Lower center of gravity, harder to grab, easier to slip away." But now, in these hallways, she had to pretend that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a weak, friendless new girl who would make an easy target. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could dislocate a shoulder with a properly applied arm bar, but she had to pretend that carrying her textbooks was a struggle. She could deliver a roundhouse kick that would drop a grown man, but she shuffled through the halls with the gait of someone afraid of taking up space. "Watch where you're going, freak!" The voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. A muscular shoulder deliberately knocked into her with enough force to send her spinning, her books tumbling to the floor in a cascade of papers and pens. The collision was calculated, designed to look accidental to any watching teachers, while being violent enough to establish dominance. Tyler Morrison stood towering over her at 6 feet of pure arrogance, his broad shoulders blocking out the fluorescent lights above. His dirty blonde hair was perfectly styled with what was probably expensive gel, each strand deliberately placed to look effortlessly tousled. His Letterman jacket, a deep blue with white leather sleeves, proudly displayed his athletic achievements: varsity football for 3 years, captain for 2, state championships, and enough sports patches to armor a small child. Behind him stood his usual crew, a carefully curated group of Jefferson High's social elite. Ashley Hendress posed like she was perpetually ready for a photo shoot, her platinum blonde hair cascading in perfect beach waves that probably cost more to maintain than Marley's grandmother spent on groceries in a month. She was head cheerleader, of course. Her uniform worn even on days when there were no games, a constant reminder of her status. Her makeup was flawless, her lips glossed to perfection, and her nails manicured in the school colors. Every movement she made was calculated for maximum impact, from the way she tilted her head to the practiced laugh that sounded like wind chimes, but carried the sharpness of broken glass. Brittany Walsh stood slightly behind Ashley, as she always did, the beta to Ashley's alpha. Where Ashley's beauty was sharp and aggressive, Brittany's was softer, more classical, with honey-colored hair and wide blue eyes that could look innocent or cruel depending on her mood. Her family's wealth was old money, the kind that came with country club memberships and vacation homes in Aspen. She dressed in designer clothes that looked simple, but probably cost more than most people's rent, each piece carefully chosen to look effortless while screaming privilege. Her father owned half the commercial real estate in town, and everyone knew that crossing Brittany meant your parents might suddenly find their lease not renewed or their loan application denied. "Sorry," Marley mumbled automatically, dropping to her knees to gather her scattered belongings. She moved quickly, but carefully, aware that any sudden movement might be interpreted as defiance. Her chemistry textbook had landed spine up, its pages fanning out and creating creases that would never quite flatten. Her calculator had skittered under someone's feet, and she had to wait for them to move before retrieving it. Several worksheets had scattered like autumn leaves, and she could see dirty footprints already marking the white paper. "I said, watch it," Tyler repeated, his voice dropping to a menacing rumble that was meant to carry threat without being loud enough to attract adult attention. As Marley reached for her chemistry textbook, Tyler's expensive Nike sneaker, the limited edition ones that cost more than her entire wardrobe, came down hard on her fingers. The pressure was calculated, enough to hurt, but not enough to break bones, though Tyler didn't know how close he was to that line. Pain shot through her hand, but Marley had endured far worse in training. Still, she let out a small whimper, knowing that showing pain would satisfy Tyler's need for dominance and might make him move on quicker. Ashley giggled behind him, the sound sharp and cruel, like glass breaking in a silent room. "Maybe she needs glasses," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of fake concern that was somehow worse than outright hostility. "Oh, wait," Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "She already has those ugly things. Maybe she needs brain surgery instead." The small crowd that had gathered laughed on cue, their entertainment coming at her expense. Some were Tyler's teammates from the football team, thick-necked boys who communicated primarily in grunts and high fives. Others were cheerleaders and their hangers-on, girls who had learned that aligning themselves with Ashley and Brittany meant protection from becoming targets themselves. A few were just random students who had stopped to watch the show, their expressions ranging from sympathy they were too cowardly to act on to eager anticipation of witnessing someone else's humiliation. Marley pulled her hand free, the joints protesting as she flexed her fingers to make sure nothing was seriously damaged. She clutched her books to her chest like a shield, fighting back tears that would only make things worse. She'd learned to cry silently in the bathroom later, where no one could see and use it against her. She hurried away as quickly as her shaking legs would carry her, but not before hearing Tyler's parting shot. "Welcome to Jefferson High, loser. Hope you brought thick skin." The laughter followed her down the hallway, echoing off the lockers like a cruel symphony. She could feel eyes on her back, some pitying, most dismissive. She'd been marked now, officially designated as a target. In the complex ecosystem of high school, she'd just been classified as prey. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that beneath Marley's meek exterior lay something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. The girl they saw as weak and defenseless was anything but. The story really began 8 years ago, when Marley was 8 years old and still reeling from her mother's death. Cancer had taken her mother slowly, painfully, over the course of a year that had felt like a lifetime. Marley remembered the hospital smell that had clung to everything, the way her mother's hand had grown thinner and thinner until it felt like holding a bird's wing, fragile and hollow-boned. After the funeral, after the relatives had gone home and the casseroles had been eaten, Marley had been left with just her grandmother and a grief so large it felt like it might swallow her whole. That's when Uncle Marcus had stepped in. He wasn't really her uncle, but rather her mother's cousin who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers before an IED had ended his military career and left him with a permanent limp and nightmares that still woke him screaming some nights. He'd shown up at their door one evening, his face gaunt and his eyes holding shadows that Marley was too young to understand. "She needs to learn to protect herself," he'd told her grandmother. "The world isn't kind to small, quiet girls. I can teach her to be strong." Her grandmother had been hesitant at first. She was a gentle woman who believed in turning the other cheek and killing with kindness. But something in Marcus's eyes, maybe the same grief she saw in Marley's, had convinced her. The training had started simply enough. Basic stances, learning to fall without getting hurt, building stamina through endless drills. Marcus's garage had been transformed into a makeshift dojo, the concrete floor covered with puzzle piece mats that smelled of rubber and accumulated sweat. He'd installed mirrors along one wall and hung heavy bags from the rafters. In one corner, he'd set up a small shrine with his medals, a folded flag, and a photo of his unit. Young men with bright smiles, who Marley would later learn hadn't all made it home. "Fighting isn't about anger," Marcus had told her during one of their first sessions, his hands gentle as he corrected her stance. "It's about control. It's about knowing you can defend yourself and choosing when to do it. The moment you throw the first punch in anger, you become everything we've trained you to fight against." As the years passed, the training had intensified. Marley learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the art of using an opponent's weight and momentum against them. She studied Muay Thai, mastering the devastating kicks and elbow strikes that could shatter bones. Marcus taught her Krav Maga, the Israeli military's fighting system designed for real-world violence, where there were no rules and the only goal was survival. She learned to target pressure points that could incapacitate without permanent damage, joint locks that could control without breaking, and strikes that could end a fight in seconds if necessary. But more than the physical techniques, Marcus taught her philosophy. They read Sun Tzu's Art of War together, discussing how the greatest victory was winning without fighting. They studied de-escalation techniques, learning to read body language and diffuse situations before they turned violent. He taught her that true strength wasn't in how hard you could hit, but in knowing when not to hit at all. "You're going to be small," he'd said one evening after a particularly grueling session. "People will underestimate you. That's not a weakness, it's your greatest advantage. Let them think you're helpless." The element of surprise is worth more than size or strength. By the time Marley was 14, she could spar with Marcus and occasionally win. She could break boards with her hands and feet, escape from holds that would trap most adults, and deliver combinations that flowed like deadly poetry. But outside the garage, she remained the quiet, nervous girl that everyone expected her to be. It was a mask she wore so completely that sometimes she almost forgot it wasn't real. The first week at Jefferson High passed in a blur of minor humiliations that built upon each other like a twisted symphony of cruelty. Tyler and his crew had marked her as easy prey, and they took every opportunity to remind her of her place in the school's social hierarchy. Their tactics were refined through years of practice, each small cruelty designed to break down their target's spirit without leaving evidence that could get them in serious trouble. On Tuesday, Ashley had accidentally bumped into Marley while carrying a full tray in the cafeteria. The collision sent chocolate milk cascading down Marley's last clean shirt, the brown liquid soaking through to her skin and leaving stains that would never fully come out. The cafeteria had erupted in laughter as Marley stood there, dripping and humiliated, while Ashley offered fake apologies loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there. You're just so small." The emphasis on the last word carried weight, a reminder that Marley was insignificant, barely worth noticing. Wednesday brought a new torment during English class. Brittany had started a rumor that Marley smelled bad, whispering loudly enough for half the class to hear that some people obviously can't afford deodorant. By lunch, the rumor had evolved into claims that Marley's family was homeless, living in their car, and that she showered in the gym locker room before school. Students had started obviously holding their noses when she walked by, moving their desks away from hers, making exaggerated gagging sounds that the teachers either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Thursday's humiliation was more targeted. Tyler had gotten hold of Marley's class schedule, probably through Ashley, who worked in the office during her free period, and made sure to be waiting outside each of her classrooms. He would knock her books from her hands, each time making it look accidental, forcing her to scramble on the floor gathering papers, while other students stepped over and around her like she was a piece of furniture. By the end of the day, several of her textbooks had torn covers, and her notebook was missing half its pages. Friday was the worst. Someone, Marley suspected Brittany, had taken a photo of her bent over picking up her books, her secondhand jeans pulling tight, and had posted it on social media with cruel comments about her body and suggestions about what she might do for money. The post had gotten hundreds of likes and dozens of comments before a teacher finally noticed and had it taken down, but the damage was done. Marley had spent her lunch period crying in a bathroom stall, wondering if transferring schools again was an option. Her grandmother noticed something was wrong, of course. Anna Davidson was 72 years old, but her mind was sharp as ever. She'd raised Marley since her daughter's death, taking on the role of parent at an age when most people were enjoying retirement. She worked as a bookkeeper for a local manufacturing company, a job she'd held for 15 years, until the company had downsized and offered her a position at their Midwest branch or severance. With Marley to care for, the choice had been obvious, even if it meant uprooting their lives. "How was school today, sweetheart?" she'd ask each evening over dinner, their modest meal of pasta or soup or whatever was on sale that week. "Fine, Grandma," Marley would reply, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Anna would study her granddaughter's face, noting the shadows under her eyes, the way she picked at her food without eating much, the slight tremor in her hands. But she also knew that pushing would only make Marley retreat further. So she waited, hoping that whatever was troubling her granddaughter would resolve itself, or that Marley would eventually open up. Marcus noticed too, during their morning training sessions. Marley's form was off, her mind clearly elsewhere. She'd miss blocks she normally caught easily, her reaction time a fraction slower than usual. "You're distracted," he observed one morning, after she'd failed to properly execute a combination they'd practiced hundreds of times. "What's going on at school?" "Nothing," Marley lied, resetting her stance. "I'm just tired." Marcus studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Remember what I taught you about awareness? You need to be present in the moment, whether you're fighting or just walking down the street. Distraction is dangerous." "I know," Marley said, but her heart wasn't in it. "And remember," Marcus added, his voice softer, "violence is always the last resort. There's no honor in fighting someone weaker than you, and no shame in walking away from a fight you could win." During her second week at Jefferson High, the harassment escalated to the gymnasium. The PE requirement was Marley's most dreaded part of the day, forcing her to change in a locker room full of girls who made no effort to hide their disgust at her plain underwear and discount store sports bra. She'd taken to changing in the bathroom stalls, but even that didn't spare her from their whispered comments and not-so-subtle pointing. Marley had presented Coach Williams with a forged note claiming she had a sprained wrist, hoping to avoid participating in volleyball for at least a few days. In reality, she was terrified that her athletic abilities would give away her training. 8 years of intensive martial arts had given her reflexes and coordination that would be impossible to hide on the court. She could already imagine the questions if she managed to spike a ball with the force her training allowed, or if she instinctively rolled out of a fall in a way that only trained fighters knew how to do. So she sat alone on the bleachers, trying to finish her English essay on The Great Gatsby, while chaos erupted on the court below. The essay was about the American dream and its corruption, which felt ironically appropriate as she watched the social hierarchy of Jefferson High play out in miniature on the volleyball court. The popular girls got to serve, the athletes dominated the game, and everyone else just tried not to get hit in the face. Tyler had convinced Coach Williams to let him help with the girls' volleyball practice, claiming he wanted to assist with training techniques as part of the team's preparation for the upcoming tournament of his senior year community service requirement. Coach Williams, who also coached the football team and clearly favored Tyler, had agreed without question. In reality, Tyler was using the opportunity to show off for Ashley and Brittany while making Marley's life miserable even in the one class where she'd thought she might have refuge. He strutted around the court like he owned it, his tank top deliberately too small to show off his muscles, offering advice to the girls that mostly consisted of unnecessary physical contact as he corrected their form. Ashley and Brittany giggled at everything he said, hanging on his every word like he was dispensing profound wisdom instead of basic volleyball tips anyone could have Googled. During a break in play, while the girls were getting water, Tyler grabbed a volleyball and began showing off with trick serves and elaborate spins. His teammates from the football team, who had mysteriously appeared despite having their own class that period, cheered him on like he was performing at the Olympics. That's when his eyes found Marley, sitting alone on the bleachers, trying to be invisible. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Hey, Marley," he called out, his voice carrying across the entire gymnasium. "Think fast." He launched the volleyball directly at her head with the force of a serve meant to score a point, not pass to a teammate. Marley saw it coming. Her trained reflexes kicked in, and she could have easily dodged or caught it. But that would have raised questions. So she let it hit her, though she managed to turn her head at the last second, so it struck her shoulder instead of her face. The impact was still enough to knock her backward off the bleacher seat, her carefully maintained facade of weakness intact, even as her body screamed at her to fight back. "Heads up, 4 eyes!" Tyler shouted after the fact, earning laughter from his audience. Marley crashed to the floor, her papers scattering across the polished wood like leaves in a windstorm. The impact had split her lip against her teeth, and she tasted the copper tang of blood as she tried to gather her belongings with shaking hands. Her glasses had been knocked off, skittering across the gymnasium floor with a plastic clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Oh my God, Tyler, you could have seriously hurt her," Ashley laughed, jogging over in her perfectly coordinated workout outfit. Her tone suggested she found the prospect amusing rather than concerning, like Marley's pain was just another form of entertainment. "She's fine," Tyler replied, following Ashley to loom above Marley. His shadow fell across her like a physical weight. "Aren't you fine, Marley? Tell everyone you're fine." Marley's hands were shaking as she felt around for her glasses, her vision blurred without them. She finally located them several feet away, one lens cracked in a spiderweb pattern that would make seeing out of that eye nearly impossible. Through her damaged vision, she could see the entire class watching her humiliation like it was a performance, some with phones out, probably recording for social media. Even Coach Williams seemed more annoyed at the disruption than concerned for her welfare, checking his watch like Marley's injury was cutting into valuable practice time. "I'm fine," she whispered, the words barely audible through her swollen lip. "Louder," Tyler demanded, crouching down so his face was inches from hers. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and obnoxious that he'd applied way too liberally. "I don't think everyone heard you." "I'm fine," she repeated, raising her voice just enough to satisfy him, while internally cataloging exactly how many strikes it would take to drop him where he stood. A palm strike to the solar plexus to knock the wind out of him, an elbow to the temple to disorient, a knee to the groin to drop him, and a rear naked choke to put him to sleep. 15 seconds, maybe less. But Uncle Marcus's voice echoed in her head, reminding her of the promise she'd made, the control she'd sworn to maintain. The harassment continued daily, each incident escalating slightly from the last, like Tyler and his crew were testing to see how far they could push before something broke. Tyler would trip her in the cafeteria, sending her lunch tray flying and covering her clothes in whatever the day's mystery meat claimed to be. She'd stopped eating lunch after the third incident, the cost of replacing ruined clothes more than her grandmother could afford. Her stomach would growl through afternoon classes, but hunger was better than humiliation. Ashley had turned character assassination into an art form, spreading rumors with the efficiency of a plague. According to the stories that circulated through Jefferson High's hallways, Marley's father was in prison. He'd actually died in a car accident when she was 2. Her grandmother was a drug addict. Anna Davidson had never touched anything stronger than aspirin, and Marley herself had been expelled from her previous school for stalking a teacher, completely fabricated. Each rumor was crafted to be just believable enough to spread, just scandalous enough to ensure everyone would remember it. Brittany used her social media influence like a weapon, posting unflattering photos of Marley taken without permission, always with captions that walked the line between clever and cruel. A picture of Marley eating alone in the library became, "When you're so weird, even the books reject you." A shot of her walking to class, shoulders hunched against the social pressure, was captioned, "Quasimodo's sister goes to our school." The posts would gather hundreds of likes and dozens of comments, each one another small cut to Marley's already fragile social standing. The rest of the school either ignored the bullying or actively participated, seeing Marley as acceptable collateral damage in their quest to stay on Tyler's good side. Teachers who witnessed the harassment would suddenly become very interested in their lesson plans or find urgent reasons to look the other way. The few students who might have been sympathetic were too afraid of becoming targets themselves to offer any support. 3 weeks into her time at Jefferson High, Marley had developed a routine designed to minimize contact with her tormentors. She arrived at school 30 minutes early, when the hallways were mostly empty except for the overachievers and the kids whose parents dropped them off on the way to work. She'd claim a corner table in the library, a spot with clear sightlines to both entrances so she couldn't be ambushed. She ate lunch in the same library, surviving on granola bars and water from the fountain. She'd identified alternate routes between classes, longer paths that avoided the main hallways where Tyler and his crew held court. After the final bell, she would wait exactly 7 minutes, long enough for the initial rush to clear, but not so long that she'd be caught alone, before making her way to the exit. But routines, she learned, only worked when other people respected them, and respect was something Tyler Morrison had never learned. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, drizzly day that made everything feel heavier than it should. Marley was hurrying toward the exit, her backpack weighing down her shoulders with the weekend's homework. Assignments she'd complete that night because she had nothing else to do. No friends to text, no parties to attend, no life outside of school and training. She heard her name being called from behind, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of departing students like a knife through paper. Her stomach dropped as she recognized Tyler's voice, that particular tone he used when he'd thought of something especially cruel. She forced herself to keep walking, quickening her pace without quite running. Maybe if she pretended not to hear him, he'd lose interest and find someone else to torture. The exit was only 50 feet away, but it might as well have been 50 miles. She could hear footsteps behind her, multiple sets, gaining ground with every step. "Hey, Marley, I'm talking to you." She walked faster, clutching her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles turned white, the rough fabric cutting into her palms. The exit was so close now, just another 30 feet. She could see the gray daylight through the glass doors. Freedom just seconds away. A hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around with enough force to make her stumble backward. The move was designed to disorient, to establish physical dominance from the start. Tyler stood before her with Ashley and Brittany flanking him like loyal attack dogs, their expressions predatory and excited. They'd cornered her in an empty hallway, the after-school activity buses having already left, taking with them any potential witnesses. The security cameras in this section were notorious for being under maintenance, a convenient fact that Tyler certainly knew. "That's really rude, you know," Tyler said, his voice carrying that false friendliness that always preceded something terrible, like the calm before a storm. "When someone calls your name, you're supposed to answer. Didn't your trashy family teach you any manners?" The insult to her grandmother made Marley's jaw clench involuntarily. Anna Davidson was the kindest, most dignified person she knew, a woman who'd worked her entire life and never complained, who'd taken in her orphaned granddaughter without hesitation and loved her unconditionally. To hear her called trashy by this privileged, cruel boy who'd never worked for anything in his life made rage bubble up in Marley's chest like lava. "I'm sorry," she forced out through gritted teeth. "I didn't hear you." "I was just trying to get home." "Oh, you were trying to get home?" Ashley repeated in a mocking baby voice. Poor little Marley wants to run home to her pathetic life. What's waiting for you there? More hand-me-down clothes, government cheese, a trailer park full of equally worthless people? They didn't live in a trailer park. They had a small but clean apartment in a working-class neighborhood, with plants on the windowsill and photos on the walls, and the smell of her grandmother's cooking filling the rooms each evening. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was theirs. "Leave me alone," Marley said quietly, taking a step backward toward the exit. But Brittany had moved with the practiced coordination of a pack hunter, sliding around to block her path, trapping her between the 3 bullies and the lockers. The metal was cold against her back, even through her cardigan. "We're just trying to be friendly," Brittany said with fake sweetness that was somehow worse than outright hostility. "You've been here for weeks, and we barely know anything about you. Like, what's your deal? Are you actually poor, or do you just dress like a homeless person for fun?" Tyler laughed, the sound sharp and mean, and moved closer, forcing Marley to press her back against the cold metal lockers. She could smell his breath, minty gum not quite masking the energy drink he'd probably chugged after practice. "I bet she's one of those welfare kids. Look at her clothes. That dress is probably older than she is. It's like she raided a dead grandmother's closet." The dress. He'd noticed the dress. It was indeed old, a simple floral pattern in faded blues and greens that had belonged to her mother. Sarah Davidson had worn it to her first job interview, to her first date with Marley's father, to the doctor's appointment where she'd learned she was pregnant. It was one of the few pieces that had survived the years, carefully preserved by her grandmother in tissue paper and cedar, altered with loving hands to fit Marley's smaller frame. When she wore it, she could almost smell her mother's perfume, almost feel her arms around her, almost remember what it was like to have a mother at all. It was her armor against the world, a reminder that she had been loved, that she came from something good and pure and worth preserving. "Please," Marley whispered, genuine fear creeping into her voice now. "Just let me go home." "What if we don't want to?" Tyler asked, reaching out to finger the fabric of her dress with hands that had never known real work, never known loss, never known what it was like to cherish something because it was all you had left. "What if we think you need a fashion intervention? This thing is so old it's probably falling apart anyway." Time seemed to slow down as Tyler grabbed a handful of the delicate material. Marley could see what was about to happen, could have stopped it if she'd been willing to blow her cover. But she hesitated, still clinging to her promise to Marcus, still trying to be the person her grandmother had raised her to be. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. The sleeve of her mother's dress ripped away from the bodice, the old seams giving way under Tyler's deliberate pull. The sound seemed to go on forever, each fiber separating with a tiny scream that only Marley could hear. Cool air hit her exposed shoulder and the simple white bra underneath. A discount store purchase that was clean, but clearly not the expensive lingerie the popular girls wore. But Marley barely noticed the exposure, barely heard Ashley's delighted squeal, or saw Brittany pulling out her phone to record the humiliation. All she could see was the torn fabric hanging limply from Tyler's hand. Her mother's dress destroyed, the last tangible connection to the woman who'd brought her into this world and loved her for 7 too short years, ripped away by someone who would never understand what he'd just done. "Oops," Tyler said with theatrical innocence, letting the torn fabric fall to the floor. It really was falling apart. Maybe we should put it out of its misery. He reached for another section of the dress, and something inside Marley finally, irrevocably snapped. The careful control she'd maintained for 8 years shattered like glass. The promises she'd made, the philosophy she'd embraced, the person she'd tried to be. It all fell away, leaving only the fighter Marcus had trained, the weapon he'd forged in the fires of discipline and repetition and pain. 8 years of training exploded through her muscles like electricity, every fiber suddenly alive with purpose and deadly intent. Her right hand shot forward in a perfect palm strike, the heel of her hand connecting with Tyler's solar plexus with the focused force of a battering ram. She'd practiced this strike thousands of times on heavy bags and training dummies, learning to direct all her body weight through that single point of contact. The impact lifted Tyler off his feet, his diaphragm spasming as every bit of air was forcibly expelled from his lungs. His eyes went wide with shock and terror as his body tried desperately to remember how to breathe. He doubled over, gasping like a fish thrown onto dry land, his face already turning an alarming shade of purple. Before Ashley could even process what had happened, before her brain could shift from predator to prey, Marley's left elbow was already in motion. The strike came up in a vicious arc, all the torque of her rotating hips concentrated into that single bony point. It caught the cheerleader directly under the chin with a crack that echoed off the lockers. Ashley's perfectly white teeth clicked together with an audible snap, her jaw slamming shut so hard she bit straight through her own tongue. Blood immediately began streaming from her mouth, ruining her perfect lip gloss and spattering across her designer workout clothes. She stumbled backward, her hands flying to her face as she made a high, keening sound of pain and shock. Brittany's eyes went wide with terror. She dropped her phone, the device clattering on the tile floor, and tried to run. But she'd made the mistake of turning her back on a trained fighter. Marley caught her by her expensive honey-colored hair, using it as a handle to spin her around. The move was brutal in its efficiency. As Brittany turned, off balance and terrified, Marley's fist was already moving. The quick jab to the nervous cluster just below Brittany's ear was precise, clinical, the kind of strike that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The bundle of nerves there, when struck correctly, would cause immediate disorientation and temporary paralysis. Brittany's eyes rolled back in her head as her nervous system briefly short-circuited. She crashed into the lockers with enough force to dent the metal, then slid to the floor in a stunned heap, her designer clothes askew, her perfect hair now a tangled mess. Tyler, still struggling to breathe, made the mistake of trying to straighten up. His face was red now, tears streaming from his eyes as his body fought for oxygen. He looked up just in time to see Marley's knee driving toward his face with the inexorable force of a piston. She'd practiced this strike countless times, learning to drive her knee upward while pulling her opponent's head down, maximizing the impact. The collision was devastating. Tyler's nose exploded in a wet crunch of cartilage and bone, blood immediately cascading down his chin and onto his precious Letterman jacket, the red stark against the white leather sleeves. The jacket he'd worn like armor, like proof of his superiority, was now ruined, marked with his own blood. He fell backward, his head hitting the floor with a sound like a dropped melon. His body went limp, unconscious before he'd even fully registered the pain. "You crazy bitch!" Ashley screamed through her injured mouth, blood and saliva spraying with each word. She was trying to get back to her feet, one hand braced against the wall for support. "You can't—" Marley's fist connected with Ashley's stomach, driving deep into her solar plexus with surgical precision. It was the same target she'd hit on Tyler, but from a different angle, designed to fold the cheerleader in half. Ashley dropped back to her knees, gasping and retching, her perfect hair falling forward to curtain her face. "That's for calling my family trashy," Marley said calmly, her voice devoid of emotion. The rage had burned through her like wildfire, leaving behind something cold and clinical. She turned back to Tyler, who was struggling to sit up while blood poured from his broken nose, painting his face in a grotesque mask. His eyes were unfocused, confused, like he couldn't quite understand how the world had suddenly turned upside down. "And this," she said, grabbing him by the collar of his ruined jacket and hauling him to his feet with surprising strength, the kind that came from years of lifting and throwing training partners twice her size, "is for touching my mother's dress." The uppercut that followed was a thing of terrible beauty. Marley planted her feet, rotated her hips, and drove her fist upward with every ounce of strength and technique she possessed. It caught Tyler on the point of his chin, snapping his head back so hard his teeth clacked together. The force of the blow literally lifted him off his feet, sending him flying backward into the lockers. The impact was tremendous. 3 locker doors popped open from the force, their locks breaking. Tyler slumped to the floor like a marionette with cut strings, unconscious before he hit the ground, a thin line of drool already mixing with the blood that pooled beneath his face. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Marley stood over her fallen tormentors, breathing hard but controlled, her stance still perfect, ready to continue if necessary. Her mother's dress was ruined, the tear exposing more skin than she was comfortable with, but she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, the constant knot of anxiety in her stomach had disappeared, replaced by something that might have been satisfaction. Ashley was whimpering on the floor, clutching her jaw and staring at Marley with newfound terror, her eyes wide and glassy with tears. Her perfect makeup was ruined, mascara running in black streams down her cheeks, mixing with the blood from her mouth to create a horror movie effect. Brittany had managed to sit up, but seemed afraid to move, pressed against the lockers like she was trying to melt into them, her whole body trembling. Tyler remained unconscious, blood still flowing from his nose, creating an expanding puddle that looked black against the white tile floor. "Listen carefully," Marley said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made both conscious girls flinch. It wasn't the voice of a scared 16-year-old girl anymore. It was the voice of someone who had trained for violence, who understood it intimately, who could dispense it with the same casual efficiency that other people tied their shoes. "You're going to leave me alone from now on. All three of you. You're not going to talk to me, look at me, or even think about me. If I hear about you bullying anyone else, anyone at all, I'll find you and we'll have another conversation. Do you understand?" Ashley nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood to pink her chin. She looked nothing like the confident queen bee who had ruled Jefferson High's social hierarchy just minutes ago. Now she was just a scared teenager who had learned that actions had consequences. Brittany managed a small squeak that might have been agreement, her designer clothes now wrinkled and stained with dust from the floor. "Good," Marley said, adjusting her torn dress as best she could, pulling the fabric to cover as much as possible. "Oh, and Brittany? Delete that video. Delete it right now, or Tyler's broken nose is going to be the least of your problems." Brittany scrambled for her dropped phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the touchscreen. She had to try 3 times to unlock it, her fingers slipping on the glass. When she finally managed to delete the video and show Marley the empty gallery, the smaller girl nodded approvingly. "Thank you. Now, when Tyler wakes up, you can tell him that this is what happens when you mess with someone's family. And if any of you decide to report this to the administration, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you did to provoke it. Something tells me your parents won't be thrilled to learn their children are bullying kids whose mothers are dead. The PR would be terrible, don't you think? Star quarterback attacks orphan, cheerleader torments grieving girl. The local news would eat that up." With that, Marley picked up her backpack, which had fallen during the confrontation, and walked calmly toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the silent hallway, each one confident and sure. Behind her, she could hear Ashley trying to wake Tyler, her voice high and panicked, words slurred through her injured mouth. "Tyler! Tyler, wake up! Oh God, there's so much blood! Brittany, call someone! Call 911! "No!" Brittany's voice was sharp with fear. She said, "We can't. Our parents will kill us if this gets out." The sound brought a small smile to Marley's lips. Let them figure it out. Let them explain the blood, the injuries, the fear in their eyes. Let them learn what it felt like to be powerless. Word of the fight spread through Jefferson High like wildfire. By the next morning, every student had heard some version of the story, most of them greatly exaggerated, but all containing the kernel of truth. The quiet new girl had destroyed 3 of the school's most popular students in a matter of seconds. The rumors grew, with each telling. Marley was secretly a black belt in karate. Partially true, though her skills went far beyond a single discipline. Her family was connected to organized crime. Completely false, unless you counted Uncle Marcus's military service. She carried weapons in her backpack. She didn't need to. She'd been trained by Navy SEALs, close, Army Rangers. She'd killed someone at her last school. Absolutely false, but Marley didn't bother correcting it. None of the rumors were entirely accurate, but Marley didn't bother correcting them. Let people think what they wanted, as long as they left her alone. Fear, she was learning, was more effective than trying to fit in had ever been. Tyler returned to school 3 days later, and the sight of him brought genuine shock to everyone who saw him. Both his eyes were black, the bruising extending from his forehead to his cheekbones in purple and yellow clouds. His nose was splinted and bandaged, white tape stark against his bruised face. He moved carefully, like everything hurt, and kept his head down when walking through the halls. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by something hunted and afraid. He still wore his Letterman jacket, but it had been professionally cleaned, though if you looked closely, you could still see faint stains on the white leather where his blood had soaked in too deep to ever fully come out. Ashley's jaw was swollen for a week, her face distorted like she'd had bad dental surgery. She couldn't eat solid food, surviving on protein shakes and soup, and when she tried to speak, her words came out slurred and painful. The queen bee who had ruled through cruel words and cutting remarks was effectively silenced. Her social media went dark for the first time since middle school. Brittany developed a nervous tic that made her jump whenever someone approached her from behind, her head constantly swiveling to check her surroundings. She started wearing her hair in a tight bun, eliminating the vulnerability of loose hair that could be grabbed. The easy confidence that wealth had given her was gone, replaced by the knowledge that money couldn't protect her from everything. More importantly, the bullying stopped completely. Not just toward Marley, but throughout the school. It was as if seeing the untouchable trinity brought low had broken some kind of spell. Students who had previously ignored Marley's existence now gave her respectful nods in the hallways, acknowledging her with a mixture of fear and admiration. Teachers who hadn't known her name suddenly took an interest in her academic performance, perhaps finally seeing her as a person rather than a ghost haunting their classrooms. Even the janitor, Mr. Peterson, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke to students, gave her a knowing wink when she passed him in the halls. He'd seen violence, understood it, and apparently approved of her use of it. A month after the fight, Marley was eating lunch in the library, still alone by choice but no longer by necessity, when someone approached her table. She looked up from her book. She was rereading Ender's Game, finding new meaning in the story of a small, underestimated child who became a weapon. To find a nervous-looking sophomore named David Chen. She recognized him vaguely as one of Tyler's former victims, a quiet kid who excelled in math and science, but had made the mistake of being Asian and smart in a school where different was dangerous. She'd seen Tyler and his crew corner David multiple times, making jokes about his eyes, his name, asking if he knew kung fu in voices dripping with mockery. Marley? David said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. His voice carried a slight tremor, like he was afraid she might hurt him too. I just wanted to say thank you. Marley marked her place in the book and gave him her attention, saying nothing but indicating he should continue. Tyler and his friends used to make my life hell, David continued, the words coming faster now that he'd started. Every single day they'd find some new way to humiliate me. Take my lunch money like we're in some 80s movie. Make me do their homework, push me into lockers, call me things. But they haven't bothered me once since, whatever you did to them. I didn't do it for anyone else, Marley said quietly, wanting to be clear about her motivations. I did it because he pushed too far, because he touched something that wasn't his to touch. I know, David replied, a small smile crossing his face. But it still helped the rest of us. Tyler had been terrorizing people for years, and the teachers never did anything about it. His dad's on the school board, his mom runs the PTA. He was untouchable. You stopped him in 30 seconds. 27 seconds, Marley corrected, having replayed the fight in her mind countless times, analyzing each move, each decision, each moment where she could have stopped but chose to continue. David's smile widened. Even better. Look, I know it's not really my business, but I wanted you to know that there are a lot of kids here who are grateful for what you did. Sarah Martinez, that freshman girl Tyler was always making cry, she actually smiled yesterday. James Thompson, the kid with the stutter, he answered a question in class without Tyler there to mock him. You didn't just free yourself, you freed all of us." After he left, Marley sat alone with her thoughts, processing this unexpected development. She'd broken her promise to Uncle Marcus about never using violence unless her life was in danger. Her life hadn't been threatened, just her dignity, her connection to her mother, her sense of self. But she couldn't bring herself to feel guilty about it. Tyler and his friends had tormented her for weeks, had made her existence a living hell, culminating in an attack on the one possession that truly mattered to her. If that didn't justify her response, what would? More importantly, she'd learned something valuable about power and respect. For her entire life, she'd believed that keeping quiet and avoiding conflict was the path to safety. She'd thought that being small and meek and invisible would protect her from the world's cruelty. But sometimes, she realized, you had to fight for your place in the world. You had to show people that you weren't an easy target, that pushing you came with consequences. Sometimes, violence was the only language bullies understood. The torn dress had been beyond repair, but her grandmother had understood when Marley explained what happened. Not the fight. She'd kept that part vague, but the destruction of her mother's dress. Anna had held her while she cried, both of them mourning the loss of that tangible connection to Sarah. "Your mother would be proud," her grandmother had said simply, stroking Marley's hair. "Not of the violence. I know there was violence, sweetheart, even if you won't tell me the details, but of you standing up for yourself. She never let anyone push her around either. She was small like you, but fierce when she needed to be. I remember when she was pregnant with you, some man tried to take her parking spot at the grocery store. She was 8 months along, could barely fit behind the wheel, but she got out of that car and gave him such a talking to that he practically ran away." The story made Marley smile through her tears. She wished she could remember more about her mother, wished she'd had more time to know the woman who had given her life. 2 months after the confrontation, Jefferson High felt like a completely different place to Marley. She still kept mostly to herself, but it was by choice now rather than necessity. She'd made a few genuine friends among the other quiet kids, the ones who understood what it was like to be different, to not fit into the easy categories that high school demanded. There was David Chen, of course, who had become her lunch companion, sharing his love of science fiction and teaching her to play chess. There was Maria Santos, a girl from her English class who wrote poetry and understood the power of words as weapons. There was Jake Williams, a skinny kid with acne who was brilliant at computer programming and had offered to teach Marley to code. They weren't the popular kids, would never be invited to the parties or included in the social media posts that defined high school relevance, but they were real. They were kind. They were hers. Her grades had improved dramatically now that she wasn't constantly stressed about being ambushed in the hallways. Her English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had pulled her aside to compliment her essay on The Great Gatsby, saying it showed unusual insight into the corruption of the American dream. Her math teacher had suggested she consider applying for advanced placement next year. Her history teacher had asked if she'd be interested in joining the debate team, having noticed her ability to construct logical arguments. Tyler had never approached her again, though she sometimes caught him watching her from across the cafeteria with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The broken nose had healed, but not straight. It now had a distinctive bump that would mark him forever, a reminder of the day he'd learned that actions had consequences. His friends still followed him, but the dynamic had changed. He was quieter now, less likely to throw his weight around, more likely to think twice before targeting someone he perceived as weak. Ashley and Brittany had redirected their energies to other pursuits, apparently having learned that bullying carried risks they hadn't previously considered. Ashley had thrown herself into college applications, perhaps realizing that her reign as Queen Bee would end with high school. Brittany had started volunteering at the hospital, possibly trying to rehabilitate her image, or maybe genuinely trying to become a better person. Marley didn't particularly care about their motivations as long as they left her and others alone. On a warm Friday afternoon in May, the kind of day that promised summer was coming soon, Marley was walking to her locker when she heard a familiar sound. Someone being shoved into the wall, books scattering across the floor. The sound triggered something in her, a muscle memory of her own humiliation, her own fear. She turned to see Tyler looming over a small freshman boy, his old patterns reasserting themselves now that enough time had passed. The boy looked terrified, scrambling to collect his belongings while Tyler stood over him, that familiar cruel smile playing at his lips. "Pick it up," Tyler was saying, his voice carrying that same tone of casual dominance he'd once used on her. "All of it. And next time, watch where you're going." The freshman scrambled to collect his belongings, his face red with embarrassment and fear. Other students walked past, determinedly looking anywhere else to avoid getting involved. Some things apparently hadn't changed. The bystander effect was still strong, the desire to avoid conflict still paramount. Marley felt the familiar anger building in her chest, but this time it was controlled, directed. She walked over slowly, her footsteps deliberate and loud enough to announce her approach. Tyler's head snapped up when he saw her coming, and the color drained from his face. His hand instinctively went to his nose, which had healed but would never look quite right again. "Problem here?" Marley asked calmly, though her eyes never left Tyler's face. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture casual, but Tyler knew what those hands could do. He'd felt it, carried the evidence on his face. "No problem," Tyler said quickly, taking a step back from the freshman. "Just a misunderstanding." "Good," Marley replied, her voice carrying that same quiet authority that had made Ashley and Brittany flinch. "Because I'd hate to think you hadn't learned anything from our last conversation." Tyler grabbed his backpack and hurried away without another word, leaving the freshman staring at Marley with something approaching worship. She helped him gather the last of his scattered papers, noting how young he looked, how small. Like she had been, like she still was, physically, though she no longer felt small. "Thank you," the boy whispered, clutching his books to his chest. "What's your name?" Marley asked. "Josh." "Josh Martinez." "Well, Josh, here's some advice. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them you're not afraid to fight back. But pick your battles carefully and never throw the first punch unless you're prepared for the consequences. Understand?" Josh nodded eagerly, though Marley doubted he truly understood. How could he? He hadn't spent 8 years learning to hurt people, learning to control that ability, learning when to use it and when to hold back. He hadn't felt the weight of violence, the responsibility of it, the way it changed you once you'd used it. As she walked away, Marley reflected on how much had changed since that day in the hallway, when Tyler had torn her mother's dress. She'd learned that respect couldn't be given. It had to be earned. Sometimes that meant enduring hardship with grace, turning the other cheek, being the bigger person. And sometimes it meant standing up and fighting for yourself when pushed too far, showing the world that you weren't an easy target, that you had teeth and weren't afraid to use them. The girl who had once cowered in fear was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it when necessary. Tyler Morrison had torn her mother's dress, had tried to tear down Marley's spirit with it, but in doing so, he'd unleashed something that would protect not just her, but others who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus had been disappointed when she'd finally told him about the fight, though not surprised. He'd seen the changes in her, the new confidence in her stride, the way she no longer flinched at sudden movements. "You broke your promise," he'd said simply, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. "I did," Marley had agreed. "And I'd do it again." Marcus had studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not violence, not cruelty, but understanding. The understanding that sometimes violence was necessary, that sometimes it was the only thing that stood between the innocent and those who would hurt them. "The promise was meant to protect you," he'd said finally, "to keep you from becoming someone who uses violence carelessly, who hurts others because they can. Do you understand the difference between what you did and what Tyler did?" "He hurt people because it made him feel powerful," Marley had answered. "Because he could, because no one stopped him. I hurt him to make him stop, to protect myself and others. There's a difference between being a warrior and being a bully." Marcus had nodded slowly, a small smile crossing his scarred face. "You've learned the most important lesson then. Violence is a tool, nothing more. It's not good or evil in itself. It's how and why you use it that matters. You used it to protect something precious to you, to stand up against cruelty. That's what I trained you for, even if I hoped you'd never need it. As the school year drew to a close, Marley found herself actually looking forward to her senior year. She had friends now, real ones. She had respect, earned through fire and blood, but maintained through restraint and wisdom. She had the knowledge that she could protect herself and others, that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. The torn dress still hung in her closet at home, a reminder of the day everything changed. Her grandmother had offered to try to fix it, but Marley had declined. Some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired, but sometimes she was learning what grew from the ruins was stronger than what had been destroyed. Tyler graduated that June, heading off to a state college on a football scholarship that his performance probably didn't merit, but his father's connections had secured. At the graduation ceremony, Marley watched him walk across the stage, noting the slight hesitation in his step when he passed her row. He'd learned fear, learned caution, learned that the world contained people who wouldn't tolerate his cruelty. It was a lesson he'd carry with him forever, along with the crooked nose that would always remind him of the day he'd pushed too far. Ashley and Brittany graduated too, heading off to different colleges, their friendship apparently not strong enough to survive the loss of their shared kingdom. Marley heard through the grapevine that Ashley was studying communications, probably hoping to find new, subtler ways to manipulate people. Brittany was going into business, following in her father's footsteps, learning to wield power in boardrooms instead of hallways. Summer passed quietly. Marley continued her morning training with Marcus, though now it felt different. She wasn't training for some hypothetical future threat anymore. She'd been tested and hadn't been found wanting. The movements felt more natural now, less like practice and more like maintenance, keeping her skills sharp should she ever need them again. Her grandmother found a better job at a small accounting firm, one that paid enough for them to move to a slightly nicer apartment. It wasn't luxury, would never be luxury, but it had 2 bedrooms instead of 1, and Marley no longer had to sleep on the couch. She decorated her new room simply, a few posters, her books, and in a place of honor, a photo of her mother wearing the dress that had started everything. When senior year began, Marley walked through the doors of Jefferson High with her head held high. She wasn't invisible anymore, wasn't trying to be. She walked with purpose, with confidence, with the knowledge that she'd been tested and survived. New freshmen looked at her with curiosity and something like awe, having heard the stories from older siblings or friends. She was a legend now, the quiet girl who had taken down the untouchables. But Marley didn't let it go to her head. She remembered what it was like to be powerless, to be afraid, to be alone. She made a point of sitting with lonely freshmen at lunch, of helping younger students who were being bullied, of using her reputation to protect rather than intimidate. She became what Tyler should have been, someone with power who used it responsibly. The year progressed smoothly. Without Tyler and his crew, Jefferson High was a more peaceful place. There were still cliques, still drama, still the usual teenage cruelties, but nothing like the systematic torment that Tyler had orchestrated. It was as if his removal had allowed the school to reset, to find a new equilibrium. Marley threw herself into her studies, her grades excellent now that she could focus on learning rather than survival. She joined the debate team, finding that her ability to think strategically translated well to verbal sparring. She even tried out for the track team, though she was careful to hold back, to run fast, but not too fast, to be good, but not suspiciously good. College applications consumed much of her senior year. With her improved grades and compelling personal essay about overcoming adversity, though she kept the details vague, she had options she wouldn't have dreamed of a year ago. She applied to schools with good criminal justice programs, thinking she might want to become a police officer, or maybe even FBI. Marcus had suggested military service, following in his footsteps, but Marley wanted a different path, one where she could protect people without going to war. In March, the acceptance letters started arriving, state schools mostly, with financial aid packages that would make attendance possible, if not easy. But then came the letter that changed everything: a full scholarship to a private college 3 states away, far from Jefferson High and all its memories. The scholarship was need-based, but also merit-based, recognizing both her academic achievements and her demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. Her grandmother cried when Marley showed her the letter. Happy tears, proud tears, the kind that said all the sacrifice and struggle had been worth it. Marcus smiled his rare, genuine smile and said simply, "You've earned this." Prom came and went. Marley attended with her small group of friends, wearing a simple dress she'd bought with money saved from a part-time job at the library. It wasn't fancy, wasn't designer, but it was hers, chosen by her, and she felt beautiful in it. She danced badly, but enthusiastically, laughed with her friends, and for one night felt like a normal teenage girl, instead of someone who'd had to fight for her place in the world. Graduation day dawned bright and clear. Marley sat with her class, listening to speeches about futures and dreams and all the possibilities that lay ahead. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with confidence, accepting her diploma with hands that had once trembled with fear but now remained steady. In the audience, her grandmother wiped away tears while Marcus stood at attention, giving her a small salute that made her smile. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and congratulations, Marley found herself face to face with someone unexpected: Tyler Morrison. He'd come back for his sister's graduation. A sophomore Marley had barely noticed. He looked different, older, more subdued. The cockiness was gone, replaced by something that might have been maturity or might have just been caution. "Marley," he said, his voice uncertain, "can we talk for a minute?" She considered saying no, walking away, leaving him standing there like he'd left her so many times. But curiosity won out. "What do you want, Tyler?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "For everything. The bullying, the harassment, the dress. I was cruel and wrong, and you had every right to do what you did." Marley studied him, looking for deception, for some angle, but he seemed sincere, or as sincere as someone like Tyler could be. "I was seeing a therapist at college," he continued, "required by the athletic department after I got into a fight with a teammate. The therapist helped me understand that I was taking out my own insecurities on other people. My dad, he's not an easy man to please, and I thought if I was tough enough, mean enough, he'd respect me. But all I did was become someone I'm ashamed of." "And you're telling me this why?" Marley asked. "Because I needed you to know that what you did, it changed me. It made me realize that there are consequences, that not everyone will just take it, that I'm not invincible. My nose reminds me every day that I chose to be cruel, and someone finally stood up to me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that the lesson stuck." Marley considered his words, weighing them against years of pain and humiliation. "I don't forgive you," she said finally. "What you did, what you took from me, can't be undone. But I hope you really have changed. I hope you never make anyone else feel the way you made me feel. That's all I wanted, for it to stop." Tyler nodded, accepting her words without argument. "For what it's worth, your mom's dress? I know it meant something to you. I'm sorry I destroyed it. That was—" He paused, searching for words. "That was the worst thing I did. Taking something that couldn't be replaced." He walked away then, leaving Marley standing among the celebrating families. She watched him go, feeling something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but maybe a kind of closure. He'd learned. He'd changed, or at least claimed to. The cycle had been broken. That evening, at her grandmother's small celebration dinner, Marley sat surrounded by the people who mattered. Her grandmother Marcus, her few close friends from school. It wasn't a big party, wasn't fancy, but it was filled with genuine love and pride. As she looked around the table, Marley realized that this was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just physical safety, but the right to exist, to be valued, to be loved, despite not fitting into the easy categories that the world tried to force her into. Marcus raised his glass of iced tea. He didn't drink alcohol anymore, hadn't since returning from Afghanistan, in a toast. "To Marley," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen real battle, who learned that strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but knowing when to hit and when to show mercy, who protected not just herself, but others, who turned victimhood into victory. As they clinked glasses, Marley thought about the girl she'd been when she first walked into Jefferson High, small, scared, trying to be invisible. That girl was gone, but not forgotten. She'd been the chrysalis from which the current Marley had emerged. The transformation had been painful, had required breaking before rebuilding, but she was stronger for it. College started in the fall, a new chapter in a new place where no one knew her story. She could reinvent herself again, could be anyone she wanted to be. But Marley had learned the value of authenticity, of being true to herself even when it was difficult. She didn't hide her training anymore, joining the college's martial arts club where she could practice openly. She didn't hide her intelligence, pursuing her studies with the dedication of someone who knew that knowledge was another form of power. She made new friends, people who knew nothing about Tyler Morrison or torn dresses or hallway fights, but she also stayed in touch with her high school friends, the ones who'd stood by her when she'd transformed from victim to victor. David Chen went to MIT, pursuing his dreams of engineering. Maria Santos got into a creative writing program. Jake Williams started his own software company before even graduating. They were all proof that the underdogs could win if they persevered. Years later, when Marley had graduated from college and was working as a victim's advocate for the district attorney's office, she would think back to that moment in the hallway when everything changed. She worked with people who had been hurt, who had been bullied and abused and made to feel small. She taught them that they had options, that they could fight back through legal channels, that the system, while imperfect, could work for them. But sometimes, in cases where the system had failed, where bullies had walked free because of connections or technicalities, she would quietly suggest self-defense classes. She would recommend instructors who understood that sometimes violence was the only language aggressors understood. She never advocated for revenge, but for preparation, for the ability to protect oneself when all else failed. She kept the torn dress packed away in a box in her closet. Sometimes she would take it out, run her fingers along the tear, and remember, not with sadness or anger anymore, but with a kind of gratitude. Tyler Morrison had meant to humiliate her, to break her spirit, to put her in what he saw as her place. Instead, he'd freed her. He'd forced her to stop hiding, to stop pretending to be weak, to stand up and fight. The dress had been ruined, but Marley had been reborn. And that, she knew, was a trade she would make again. The girl who had stood at the entrance of Jefferson High School, clutching her worn backpack straps, invisible and afraid, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own strength, who protected those who couldn't protect themselves, who understood that sometimes the greatest courage was in throwing the first punch, and sometimes it was in holding back. Tyler Morrison had torn her mother's dress, but in doing so, he'd unleashed something far more powerful than he could have imagined. A protector, a warrior, a survivor who would spend her life making sure that other scared, small, invisible kids would have someone in their corner, someone who understood what it was like to be pushed too far and to push back. The dress was torn, but Marley was whole, and that was enough.